Hello, good day. Welcome to our class for today. For today, I will discuss a brief history of the evolution of the political science as a discipline and as well as the introduction of its traditional approach in explaining political phenomenon. Before I start, I would like you to know two basic terms in which these terms will serve as the framework on how I divided the syllabus with regards to the division of the um, political science approaches that we will discuss throughout the semester. The first one is ontology, and the other one is epistemology. Basically, ontology is how each person views the world. It's how we see or understand the essence of things around us. For example, ontology entails the answer to the following questions: are all people greedy? Are all states seeking self-preservation, survival, or security? Is sharing and benevolence really impossible in global affairs? So basically, ontology usually answers or provides answers that mimics or resembles sweeping generalization. Second, another characteristic of ontological statements is that they are usually normative. They are usually, or you will sense that these statements, ontology usually impose or prefers to say that this is what we should do, this is what should happen. On the other hand, epistemology is the means and ways in which we come to know something about the world. So basically, it is our way in general how to confirm our ontology. Examples of this are scientific philosophies that I enumerated, for example, positivism, empiricism, logicism, and interpretivism. Later, I will expound on the following isms that I mentioned. And then there's another term that I included in this discussion, which is methodology. So, methodology is a part of epistemology, however, it is an elaboration or enumeration of more specific ways of knowing the world. So it's like a subset of epistemology. If epistemology confirms ontology, methodology are the ways and means in which we specify the ways in how epistemology affirms or confirms ontology. So this is where our understanding of different scientific methods enter. So we talk about qualitative versus quantitative, or we also talk about various research procedures like conducting interviews, survey, content analysis, discourse analysis, observation, phenomenology, etc. As I have told you in the first day of the classes, the division of the approaches that I discussed in the syllabus is divided into three. And these three divisions are not just placed because I like them. It is particularly placed because there is a ontological basis. The first two divisions are based on the ontology that actors behave based on their consideration of material interest. So they are behaving or they are functioning based on their perception of material interest. On the other hand, the last section is based on the ontology that actors are not really functioning or moving or behaving based on material interest but based on various factors like culture, ideas, ideologies, and different socio-cultural orientation. History of political science. In this slide, I will present a brief history or historical sketch of the discipline of political science. Well, basically, the study of politics was a part of philosophy, theology, and law. However, it all changed upon the onset of the World War II, in which various European scholars, particularly scholars from German universities, migrated to the United States. Why? Because majority of these German intellectuals have Jewish ancestry or Jewish heritage. Therefore, they felt that they are no longer safe in Europe, therefore they fled to the United States. These German intellectuals, since they are already intellectuals and they have already contributions to the knowledge, particularly with philosophy and social sciences and humanities, they were able to occupy professorial positions in American universities. In fact, they are the ones who developed the discipline in the land of the United States, as they aim to create a specific understanding of, or sorry, a scientific understanding of the study of politics. They wanted, they intended to apply the scientific philosophy of positivism. So, what is positivism? In the previous slide, I mentioned that positivism is an example of epistemology. So, positivism is a scientific philosophy that states that in order for a specific truth or knowledge to be affirmed as objective or real or correct, it must follow two criteria. Number one is what we call empiricism, and on the other hand, the other one is called logicism. Empiricism means that the idea must be conceived by the five senses. It's like to see is to believe. Therefore, in order to prove that a certain claim is true and real, it must be conceivable by the faculties of the human person, particularly with the five senses. The second criteria followed by positivism is what we call logicism. What is logicism? Logicism means that if you were able to prove a certain idea or knowledge in a specific condition, it can be or it must be replicated in other contexts, in other time frame, in other situations. It must hold true in all situations. Why? Because that will no longer be considered as a science. So, for example, remember our scientific laws when we were in high school, like in chemistry and physics. Those scientific theories and laws are applicable in all contexts, in all time frames, and in all locations. The scientific theory, for example, with regards to the composition of minerals, of force, inertia, matter, they are also applicable not only in planet Earth, but they also in the other parts of the galaxy. So that is what we mean by logicism. Okay, that criteria posed by positivism was intentionally applied to the study of politics. Thus, it emerged to what we call the modern day political science. So I want you to note the different terms that I use. Before the German immigration of the before the immigration of German intellectuals to the United States, the word that I'm using is the study of politics. But upon the introduction of positivism to the study of politics, I am now calling it political science. So, what are the implications of the insertion of positivism in political science? Number one is what we call the behavioral revolution, in which the approaches in political science is no longer focused on a descriptive analysis of political events, but that there's already a borrowing of concepts from the field of economics, psychology, and sociology in order to explain political phenomena. Okay, this behavioral revolution became valid for a number of years until political scientists were no longer satisfied with the products and the result research outcomes of behavioralist approach. Why? Because in the quest of American political scientists to formulate general theories of science like a grand theory, these attempts were deemed fruitless. Why? Because it's impossible to create a grand theory in the social sciences. Bakit, sir? Why? Because number one, you cannot quantify the human person. What we can do is at least yung tinatawag nating heuristics. We assign value on the activities, motivations, and then run statistics through it. However, the application of statistics is not what? It's not infallible. It's not real correct. Why? In your future statistics classes, you will have this concept of margin of error. Wherein, in the social sciences, we allot 5% margin for possible deviance. So, hindi talaga siya perfect assumption na ito yung mangyayari. So, ganun yung nangyari sa behavioral revolution. So, since it's impossible to create a general theory of science through the use of quantitative or statistical methods, there was a what? There was a clamor that the behavioral revolution or the behavioral approaches are no longer valid, especially with the focus of the behavioral revolution to the study of individual behavior in politics. So, uh, some political scientists right now, especially the modern day ones, they tended to rediscover our roots, our traditional approaches, and repackage it in a new way in order to explain political phenomena in which they are successful. And this is the last point that I presented in this slide, wherein there was a reintroduction to the study of institutions. Okay, let us discuss each stage in detail. So in this slide, I am talking about the pre-World War II status of the study of politics. So hindi pa siya political science. So I mentioned a number of thinkers here. For example, Plato. So you will see that a number of thinkers here are from the field of humanities, philosophy, theology, and law. For example, Plato. The works of Plato in or his contribution to the political thought has something to do with leadership, in which he argued that all leaders must have a background in philosophy, thus the term philosopher king. Second, Aristotle. His contribution to the development of political theory or thought was his inquiry about the best form of government. For him, the best form of government is aristocracy. So, how did he arrive to this assumption, or yeah, to this affirmation that aristocracy is the best form of government? It is because of his theory of middle, or theory of means, or yung theory of middle, of the middle position. So, for Aristotle, all extreme behavior, both in left and right, are considered vices, and the moderation of these vices, which is located in the middle, is called virtue. So he applied that in the concept of government making, in which he designated that monarchy and democracy are vices, they are extremes. And what is the middle position between monarchy and democracy? He called it aristocracy. Another contributor for this is Saint Thomas Aquinas, in which he provided a concise and very influential definition of law, which is still being used in the legal circles even up to the present era. For Thomas Aquinas, law is the ordinance of reason towards the achievement of common good. So therefore, Thomas Aquinas recognized the human faculty of reason and its proper purpose being normative, which is for the application towards policies that will entail the achievement of common good. Another one is Machiavelli, in which he has a more realistic, yeah, he has a more realistic conception of politics, in which he enumerated various qualities of a leader, which is totally contradictory to what Plato said. What are those qualities? There's a lot. It's a list. So I recommend everyone to read the book The Prince. And then the last one, that though they are not the last thinkers, it just happened that I included them as the last example. Here are the social contract theories like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, in which they talked about the state of nature and what is the purpose of the state. The social contract theories usually theorize what is the state of human affairs if there's no such thing as state or institution. For Hobbes, he conceived it as chaotic, brutal, warlike, brutish. For Jean Locke, he conceived it as lawless, but there's no such thing as or but there's no such it doesn't mean that it's automatically chaotic. So for Hobbes, there must be the existence of the state or any form of political institution is justifiable in order to end the anarchy that he is conceiving in the state of nature. For John Locke, the state or any political institution must be instituted in order to protect each individual's life, liberty, and property. Okay, those thinkers that I mentioned in the previous slide are they belong to what we call the traditional school in political science. And this traditional school in political science is called the old institutionalism. It is called institutionalism because the concern is to how to establish arrangement in order to guide individual behavior. Basically, during the traditional school or during the dominance of the traditional school, political science is regarded as simply the study of the state. So makikita mo in the previous slides in the discussion, it has something to do that institutions are assumed to constrain individual political behavior, and usually those suggestions about the nature of institutions, particularly the state, has or usually they are what? Prescriptive in nature, very normative. So here are the observed features of old institutionalism. The first feature is what we call legalism, in which the law constitutes both the framework of the public sector itself and a way in which government can affect the behavior of its citizens. For legalists, to be concerned with institutions is to be concerned with law. I would like to use the example. Okay, in modern day politics, for example, here in the Philippines, using the legalistic method, how do we explain the decision of the Philippine Congress to legislate the anti-terrorism law? In this regard, as we have said, legalist explanations usually invokes what the law is saying. So therefore, how does the legalist method explain the passage of the anti-terrorism law? Therefore, it will invoke. That's why I noted the following points here in the answer portion. It will invoke what is written in law in order to explain the passage of a law. So therefore, we will look on the Constitution, Saligang Batas, and how it prescribes the proper procedure of passing of laws. So there will be what? Proponents from the Senate and the House of Representatives, and then that proponent will bring it to the committee. The committee will approve it, and then the committee inside both the Senate and House of Representatives will offer the approved draft of the bill to the first reading, second reading, and third reading. if the bill will pass those stages of reading, it will be what? It will be collated for a joint committee between the Senate and the House of Representatives until both houses will agree on a final draft to be submitted to the President. So that's a legalist explanation because it is what our 1987 Constitution states on how to create a law. Does it have limitations? Of course. Actually, that is very limited. That is very close on what the law is saying because you did not account the personal motivations or the personal interest of those who voted in favor or not. You just look on what the law is saying. You did not also accounted who are the groups in the civil society who support or oppose the said measure. You did not also accounted whether the president who's waiting to sign the finished draft of the law, whether he is supportive or not. Those three elements are important also in the dynamics of the lawmaking process, but they are disregarded since we are talking about with regards to legalistic features. We only look on what the law is saying. Second is what we call structuralism. Apologies, I forgot to change. It's structuralism. Structuralism assumes that structure matters and the structure determines individual behavior. So, what is structure? Structure doesn't really mean that it's an official law or official arrangement, but it refers to the environmental context. So it's abstract and descriptive in which an actor is currently located or behaving. So because of this structure, it determines the individual behavior of a certain actor because it provides what are the ways the actor can pursue or what are the options the actor can choose or pursue. What or another one is what are the expectations towards an actor's behavior and etc. So structuralism has something to do on the focus on major institutional features of political system and define them based on legal terms. So I gave another example here. Using the structuralist method, how do we explain the decision of the Philippine Congress to legislate the anti-terrorism law? Answer. Okay, determine the structure of policymaking process after the final reading. So I already moved after the final reading because I already explained the initial approaches or the initial procedures based on the legalistic method on the previous slide. Okay, there will be a final reading, a joint committee between the Senate, and submission of the law to the President, and then came this will have the issues whether the President will veto it or the Congress will accept the veto. Okay, so based on these arrows na nakikita mo, what is the structure here? The structure here are the options provided by the Supreme Court that both the President and the Congress can pursue during the final or during the signing of the bill. So, according to the Constitution, the President can veto the whole law or parts of the law. However, if he will veto it or not, the Congress can override that veto. Such is the structure that we are talking about. This is the condition wherein the players or the actors are currently operating. So what are the considerations that the actors must weigh in? So in this case, for the president, he will weigh in whether the Congress will override his veto. Or on the other hand, the Congress will weigh in or consider the possible action of the president to veto the law that they submitted to him. So, ayun. So, the structure is the constitutional provision about vetoing, and then the individual behavior that is being theorized or being predicted here is the possible step that can be pursued both by the president and the Congress. How do these processes affect individual behavior is one valid question as we reflect on how to use the structuralist approach. One example, for the president, veto power is dependent on the constitutional provision that the Congress can override his refusal to sign. This is what I have discussed earlier. The next feature of old institutionalism is what we call holism, which is the use of comparison method. However, when we compare whole systems, not specific parts. So an example that I provided here is the comparing countries with same democratic systems. For example, the United States and the Philippines, in which it is historically said that the Philippines copied the United States political setup. So it's like, how do you approach this phenomenon? You approach them by, making a Venn diagram, list all their similarities and differences. However, this approach has another limitation similar to legalism and structuralism. Why? Because the limitation of the holistic approach is that you might fall on the scenario that you're already comparing apples from oranges. So you are comparing two countries that are not really comparable. So for example, the United States and the Philippines, these two countries are not comparable because the United States is a superpower while the Philippines is only a small power. The size, population of the United States is incomparable to the Philippines. The politics of the United States is comparable with the Philippines, especially with regards, for example, to voting. The Philippines, we conduct indirect democracy. We conduct representative voting. We vote for our representatives like congressmen, district representatives, party list representatives, senators. In the U.S., although they conduct that, they have a um, special way of electing the president, which is through what we call the electoral college. So yeah, you are comparing apples from oranges. Next one is historicism. Historicism is the analysis which is concerned with how contemporary political systems were embedded in their historical development as well as their socio-economic present. The researcher need to understand the developmental pattern which produces the system. So simply, this is the political phenomenon, and then in order to explain that political phenomenon, you trace back the history which led to the occurrence of such phenomenon. So for example, how can we explain the Catholic Church strong influence in Philippine politics? So in this discussion that I put, or in the answer in the bullet that I put in this slide, I trace it back to the Spanish colonial era, that there's such thing as the unity of church and state, and then it was um, partially altered during the American period. Same with the Japanese period, and then since yun nga, majority of the Filipinos are still professing the Catholic religion even after the Second World War, it emerged and it evolved until the Catholic Church in the Philippines also actively participated in the ouster of Marcos and Estrada, and then the present part. So yeah, you trace back the history. Is there a limitation with this approach? Yes, this approach is valid. I admit that. However, the limitation of this approach is that it inhibits um, it inhibits political science to construct a theory that can be tested in different times, in different locations, and in different phases. Why? Because every country has its own unique historical background. You cannot generalize the historical background of countries because, for example, with regards to colonial experience, iba-iba experience ng mga bansa. Iba, iba ang colonial experience ng mga dating kolonya ng Spanya, ng Great Britain, ng Netherlands, ng France, ng Germany, etc. So, by the very fact that countries have different colonial experiences, you can no longer construct a unified theory. And then the last the last characteristic of all institutionalism is its normative value, in which I would like to reiterate that it has something to do on the concern for the good government. Particularly, it resonates with the assumptions of Plato and Aristotle, and the old institutionalist approach answers the question, what should happen or what should we do, instead of describing what is happening based and then answer the question using our five senses, describe it, or what are we currently doing. So very imposive, prescriptive, hence normative. So in this case, using the normative approach, sorry, I failed to edit again. How can we explain the failure of the government to immediately curb the pandemic in the Philippines? So these are the answers. We should have closed our borders early in January. Mass testing must be done. So look at the phrasing, the way the statements are formulated. So disregard exclamation points, but there must be what? You notice that there are modals here. There must the presence of should and must, because yun nga, the old institutionalist approach is normative. It has a prescriptive and impulsive tone of what is the proper way of handling things, particularly political phenomena. Okay, as I have said, the migration of German intellectuals to the United States led to the introduction of positivism in the study of politics, in which led to the emergence of political science. So the behavioral revolution is one of its outcomes. It's a revolution brought by the American universities, particularly the University of Chicago. Thus, if you're going to read your books in the history of political science, you have this what we call the Chicago School. This behavioral revolution really accounted the introduction of positivism in political science. I think I already discussed it earlier, in which political science aspired to copy the way of the natural sciences. So the use of empiricism and logicism. Empiricism, the use of five senses. Logicism, construction of theories that can be applied in all places, in all time contexts, and it can be, yeah, as I have said, replicated in order to be affirmed. So what are the implications of this application? The use of quantitative methods, particularly statistics, and then the use of various methodologies such as surveys, experiments. And with regard to the use of surveys and experiments, for example, there are numerical values that will be yielded, and then the theory construction will occur. So, paano siya mangyayari? Yung numerical values that were yielded from the surveys or the experiments conducted, they will be applied in statistical models. However, there's a caveat in there because, as I have told you earlier, human nature cannot be really quantified. So we allot this what we call margin of error quantity, in which in the social sciences we have 0.05 or 5% alpha margin of error that things will not be perfect. Second, the analysis using statistics and quantitative methods assumes that the agents or the actors being studied are operating in what we call ceteris paribus system. So what is a ceteris paribus system? It means that it's an assumption that all other factors are constant or equal. So it's like they assume that the study is happening in a vacuum inside a laboratory, but it's not, because ayun nga, the human person is dynamic, and then the human person is affected by his or her own respective historical and socio-economic and political context kung saan siya gumagalaw. So much of it scrap muna natin yung assumption na yun because that will be used in the new institutionalism discussion in the upcoming lecture. So the entrance of the behavioral revolution led to the development of two new alternative approaches aside from old institutionalism. Number one is the rational choice approach, which is copied from economics, and then second is the behavioral approach copied from psychology and sociology. So in this case, I will first discuss the behavioral approach. In this, yun nga, same name, behavioral evolution, then behavioral approach. The behavioral approach, the political science borrowed concepts from sociology and psychology. So, some of those concepts are orientations, culture, um, cognitive functions, cognitive processes, learning. Why? Because the aim of behavioral approach is to explain individual political behavior. So usually it is usually used in the context of voting or public opinion or measuring public support towards a candidate or proposed bills. On the other hand, there's this another alternative called the rational choice approach. So what's the rational choice approach? The rational choice approach assumes that individuals are faced with various options every day. And in terms of politics, maraming options, particularly with decision makers. So how do decision makers filter those options and conduct a policy making in which yun nga, nag-choose ng isang option or choice. So how do individuals filter or yeah, I think the proper word is filter or yeah, or to choose this specific option or options in his day-to-day political affairs. According to the rational choice approach, individuals, when faced with a number of options, ang sabi ng rational choice approach, yung individual daw na yun, ang kukunin niyang option ay yung option or options, pwedeng plural, pwedeng isa yung kukunin niya or dalawa, depende sa situation, na yung option or options na yon ay magbibigay sa kanya ng maximum benefit. How to determine that maximum benefit? Through material interest and material calculations. So, yeah, that is the rational choice approach which is copied from the economics. And very economic concept siya kasi you look on the material gains. So, the rational choice approach has its own limitations because, yun nga, as I have told you, hindi lahat naman ng individuals material consideration yung pumapasok sa isip niya in order for him to choose or not. Minsan, yung rationality niya, yung consideration niya to choose what is beneficial for him or her is not based on material factors or material gains but to his through his values, predispositions, and schema, mga ganong factors or cognitive functions. So therefore, if hindi siya kaya i-explain ng rational choice approach, ang mag-explain sa kanya ay yung behavioral approach. Thank you.